Pope Leo replaced the most powerful cardinal in America, a man who gave 50 years of his life to the Vatican, a man who crossed every continent, served under 3 popes, and spent nearly a decade trying to deliver a message that most American bishops simply refused to hear. And when he finally walked out that door, something had already happened between him and the Pope that nobody in the media stopped to notice. And that's exactly what I want to talk to you about today. His name is Christophe Pierre. Born in Rennes, France in 1946 into a family where the church was not just a Sunday obligation, it was the air they breathed. His mother helped found Catholic Action in Brittany. His father started a scout troop tied to the church. From the very beginning, faith was not something the Pierre family practiced. It was something they lived, and young Christophe absorbed all of it. He grew up partly in Africa, Madagascar, Malawi, Zimbabwe, in a family that moved with the world. He went to seminary at 17. He was ordained a priest in 1970. And then when his bishop suggested he pursue a career in Vatican diplomacy, he hesitated. He was afraid it wouldn't be pastoral enough. He was afraid of losing contact with real people, real lives, real suffering. That hesitation tells you everything about who this man is. He eventually said yes. And what followed was one of the most extraordinary careers in the history of Vatican diplomacy. New Zealand, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Cuba, Brazil, Geneva, Haiti, Uganda, Mexico, country after country, decade after decade. Pierre went where the Pope sent him, and he carried the message every single time. Now, while Pierre was building all of this, something else was happening on the other side of the world. In the streets of Peru, in the slums of Chicago, in the mission fields of Latin America, a man named Robert Francis Prevost was doing something very similar. Not as a diplomat, as a missionary, as a pastor who had given himself entirely to the people at the margins, the forgotten, the poor, the ones the church sometimes struggles to reach. 2 men, 2 completely different paths, and the same fire burning inside both of them. Drop your name and where you're watching from in the comments right now. I want to know who's with me for this story. It was Mexico that changed Pierre most deeply. He arrived there in 2007, just as a major gathering of Latin American bishops was wrapping up in Aparica, Brazil. The bishop who picked him up at the airport had literally just flown back from that conference the day before, and Pierre began hearing about what had happened there. A new pastoral vision. A new way of being church, rooted in encounter and listening and going out to the peripheries rather than waiting for people to come to you. The document that came out of Aparica would later become the foundation of an entire pontificate, because the man who led the committee that drafted it was a cardinal from Buenos Aires named Jorge Bergoglio. 6 years later, Bergoglio would become Pope Francis, and the vision born in Aparica would spread to the entire Catholic world. Pierre saw it from the inside. He understood it before most people even knew what it was, and Robert Francis Prevost, the man who would one day become Pope Leo XIV, understood it too. He had lived it. In Peru, where he served for years as a bishop close to the people, he had built a church that looked exactly like the one Aparica described. Not a church of grand pronouncements from above, a church of presence, of walking with people, of staying when it would have been easier to leave. 2 men shaped by the same vision, one carrying it through the corridors of Vatican diplomacy, the other living it in the streets of Latin America. Neither of them knowing yet exactly where it would all lead. In 2016, Pope Francis made a decision. He appointed Christophe Pierre as Apostolic Nuno to the United States of America, the Vatican's top representative in one of the most complex, most polarized, most powerful Catholic communities on the planet. It was not an easy assignment. The American Church had spent years in deep internal tension. There were divisions. There were bishops who saw Pope Francis not as a shepherd to follow, but as a problem to manage. Pierre's predecessor at the nonature had become one of the Pope's most vocal critics. The culture Pierre was walking into was shaped by resistance, by suspicion, by a version of Catholicism increasingly defined more by politics than by the gospel. And into all of that walked a quiet Frenchman from Brittany who had spent decades working in some of the poorest corners of the world. He didn't come with a megaphone. He didn't come looking for a fight. He came with a message. The same message he had been carrying since Mexico, since Aparica, a church that goes out, a church that listens, a church that accompanies people in their real lives. He said it in speech after speech, year after year, in room after room full of American bishops, and many of them heard it, but many of them didn't. Some were polite about it, others made it clear they considered his message outdated, a relic of a vision they had already decided didn't apply to them. Nearly 10 years, same message, same rooms, and the resistance never fully went away. Can you imagine that? Spending a decade trying to help people understand something, not because it's your opinion, not because it's your personal agenda, but because it's where the church is going, because it's what the Pope is asking. And still, year after year, being met with skepticism, with indifference with people who had already made up their minds. That's the weight he carried. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Robert Francis Prevost was quietly rising from missionary to bishop. from bishop to the head of the Vatican's dicaster for bishops, the office responsible for recommending episcopal appointments across the entire church. The same kind of work Pierre had been doing in America, but now from Rome. The same vision, the same compass. Two men who had never needed to coordinate because they were already pointing in the same direction. If this story is moving you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because what comes next is the part that most people completely missed. May 2025, the Siene Chapel, a conclave. Cardinal Christophe Pierre was 79 years old. He walked into that room as an elector, one of the men responsible for choosing the next pope. And when the white smoke rose, when the announcement came, when the first American pope in the history of the Catholic Church stepped onto the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, Pierre was there. He had been part of that moment. The man elected took the name Leo XIV, and from the very first hours of his pontificate, he made something clear. 2 days after his election, he stood before the College of Cardinals and said, "I would like us to renew together today our complete commitment to the path that the Universal Church has now followed for decades in the wake of the Second Vatican Council. The path, the same path Pierre had been pointing to for 10 years in America." Leo XIV had barely begun his pontificate, and he was already speaking the language Pierre had been speaking all along. Not because one was following the other, but because both of them had been formed by the same vision, the same church, the same mission, the same conviction that the reforms of the Second Vatican Council were not a chapter in history to be debated. They were a living road, and the church was still walking it. Pierre heard those words from the new pope and recognized them immediately. He had said them himself. He had tried to explain them himself for nearly a decade in a country that wasn't always ready to listen. And now the pope was saying them out loud to the whole world from the very first days of his pontificate. But the story wasn't over yet, not even close. November 2025, Baltimore, Maryland, the Fall Assembly of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. Cardinal Pierre stood before the assembled bishops of America for what would turn out to be one of his final addresses in that role, and he opened with a question. Where have we been and where are we going? He answered it by placing the entire conversation under what he called a guiding light. And that light, he said, was the teaching and vision of the Second Vatican Council. He didn't whisper it. He said it clearly, directly, with the full weight of his 50 years behind it. Vatican II, he told the bishops, remains the key to understanding what kind of church we are called to be today. And then he added something that most coverage didn't highlight. He said, Pope Leo also is convinced of this. He wasn't speaking for himself. He was speaking for the Pope. He was telling the room, this is not my opinion. This is the direction. This is where we are going. According to reporting from Where Peter Is, which covers the Vatican's pastoral vision with depth and care, not everyone in that room was ready to hear it. Some found the message repetitive. Some considered it out of step with the moment. The same resistance that had been there for years, it was still there. He had spent nearly a decade saying the same thing, and some of them still weren't ready to listen. But here's what Pierre knew, and what the room didn't know yet. He knew what was coming. Weeks later, January 7th, 2026, Rome, the Paul VI Audience Hall inside the Vatican, Pope Leo XIV walked in for his weekly general audience. The Holy Year had just ended. A new chapter was beginning, and the Pope had decided that this new chapter would open with something very specific. A full series of catechesis dedicated to the Second Vatican Council. Week after week, document by document, he was going to take the entire church back to the source. And when he opened his mouth to begin, the very first thing he said about Vatican II, the very first description he gave of what the council means for the church today was this: it is the magisterium that still constitutes the guiding star of the church's journey today. The guiding star. Pierre had said guiding light in Baltimore. The Pope said guiding star in Rome. Same image, same conviction, same road. And nobody needed to make a phone call. Nobody needed to coordinate a message, because these two men had been shaped by the same vision for so long that when one of them spoke, the other one answered naturally, completely without even trying. Think about what that means for a second. Think about Cardinal Pierre standing in that room in Baltimore in November, saying the same thing he had been saying for 10 years to bishops who were only half listening, some of them dismissing it as old news, as something that didn't apply to the moment they were living in. Think about that man walking out of that room carrying all of that. The resistance, the skepticism, the quiet exhaustion of a decade of patient faithfulness. And then weeks later, the Pope of the Catholic Church stands up in front of the entire world and says the exact same thing, not as a courtesy, not as a coincidence, as a conviction. According to Vatican News, which covered the January 7th audience in full, Pope Leo XIV described Vatican III not as a historical event to be studied from a distance, but as a living reality, a prophecy. He said that the Church must not allow to fade. He called on the faithful to return to the Council's documents directly, not through second-hand interpretations, not through hearsay, but through a personal encounter with the texts themselves. He said the council was not a break with the past. It was a door to the future. Pierre had been knocking on that door for 10 years in America, and now the Pope had just opened it in front of everyone. This is the moment that most people missed, not because it was hidden, because they weren't paying attention to the right thing. They were watching the headline, "Cardinal retires at 80, new appointment announced." Oh, and they missed the heartbeat underneath it. They missed the fact that the man being replaced had just been publicly, quietly, completely vindicated by the man replacing him. Not with a ceremony, not with a press release, with words, the same words in front of the whole church. Now, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about this before you answer in the comments below. Have you ever said something you believed deeply, something you knew was true and been ignored, maybe laughed at, maybe dismissed, and then sometime later, someone else said the exact same thing, and suddenly everyone was listening? That feeling, that specific, bittersweet, quietly powerful feeling, that is what this story is about. Not just for Cardinal Pierre, for all of us. Because what happened between these two men is not just a footnote in church history. It's a lesson in what faithfulness actually looks like when no one is applauding, when the room isn't responding, when you keep showing up anyway, not because you need the validation, but because you believe the message is bigger than your need to be heard. Pierre kept showing up for 50 years. He kept showing up. And when the moment came, the Pope showed up for him. Tell me in the comments, has something like this ever happened to you? A moment when you were finally vindicated by life, by time, by someone you respected. Write it below. I read every single one. January 30th, 2026. Washington, D.C., the Apostolic Nunciature, the official residence of the Vatican's representative to the United States. Cardinal Christophe Pierre turned 80 years old that day, and the Church did not let that moment pass quietly. The Apostolic Nunciature hosted an official farewell reception in his honor. And the guest of honor, the man who flew in from Rome specifically to be there, was Archbishop Edgar Panapara, the substitute for General Affairs of the Vatican Secretariat of State, the second highest ranking official in the Vatican's day-to-day operations, the man who keeps the gears of the Holy See turning. He came to Washington for Pierre's birthday for his farewell. That is not a routine gesture. In the world of Vatican diplomacy, that kind of presence sends a message that no press release could ever fully express. It says, this man matters. What he built here matters. The Church sees it even when others didn't. The American Church paused. Bishops, clergy, lay leaders, people who had sat across from Pierre in meetings, people who had heard his speeches, people who had agreed with him, and people who had pushed back. They all came together that day to honor what he had given. 50 years of service, nearly 10 years in America alone, and at the end of it, not a quiet exit, not a footnote, a celebration, with Rome present, with the Vatican watching. On March 7th, 2026, Pope Leo XIV formally accepted Cardinal Pierre's resignation as Apostolic Nuncio to the United States. His successor was named Archbishop Gabriel Giordano Caccia, a seasoned Vatican diplomat with deep experience at the United Nations and in multilateral diplomacy. A man built for the complexity of the American assignment. In this particular moment, the transition was clean, professional, expected, but here is what I want you to hold on to as we move toward the end of this story. Pope Leo XIV did not just replace Cardinal Pierre, he received him, he honored him, he confirmed publicly in front of the entire church with his own words on January 7th everything that Pierre had spent a decade trying to say. And that matters not just for Pierre, for everyone who has ever served faithfully in a place that wasn't ready to receive what they were carrying, for everyone who has ever kept going when the room wasn't listening, for everyone who has ever trusted that the message was bigger than the moment and kept delivering it. Anyway, Pierre planted, and Leo XIV is watering. That's not a metaphor. That's what's actually happening right now in the Catholic Church in America. The seeds Pierre spent years sowing in episcopal appointments, in pastoral conversations, in quiet diplomacy conducted over nearly a decade. Those seeds are still growing. The bishops appointed during his tenure are still serving. The vision he carried is still alive. What do you think about this? I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell me what part of this story stayed with you the most. And if you're not subscribed to this channel yet, do it now, because we cover stories like this one. Stories that matter, stories that go deeper than the headlines every single week. And you don't want to miss what's coming next. There is something that happens in the Catholic Church that the outside world rarely notices. It moves slowly. It works quietly, and its results are often only visible years, sometimes decades, after the decisions that produced them were made. Cardinal Pierre understood this better than almost anyone, because when you spend 50 years as a Vatican diplomat, you stop measuring success in headlines. You stop measuring it in applause. You start measuring it in something much harder to see, in the quality of the people placed in positions of leadership, in the direction of communities over time, in the slow, patient turning of a very large ship, That is what Pierre did in America. Not just in the speeches, not just in the Baltimore assemblies, in the work that happened behind closed doors, in the careful, deliberate process of recommending bishops, men who would go on to serve their communities for decades, men shaped by the same pastoral vision that Pierre carried, men who understood because Pierre helped them understand that being a bishop is not about managing an institution. It is about accompanying a people. Pope Leo XIV saw all of this. He had watched it from Rome. He had understood what Pierre was building long before most people did. And when he stepped onto the balcony of St. Peter's for the first time as Pope, he carried with him the full weight of everything Pierre had helped prepare. This is why the story of these two men is not just a story about one cardinal and one pope. It is a story about continuity, about how a vision survives beyond any single person, about how faithfulness sustained over time quietly shapes the future, even when no one is watching, even when the room isn't listening. Let me tell you something about the word prophet. We use it today mostly to mean someone who predicts the future. But in its original meaning, in the tradition of the church, in the language of Scripture, a prophet is something different. A prophet is someone who speaks the truth of God into a situation that isn't ready to hear it. Not to impress anyone, not to be right, but because the truth needs to be spoken whether it lands or not. Where Peter is a publication that covers the Catholic Church with remarkable depth, described Cardinal Pierre in March 2026 as a prophet to the Americas. Not because he predicted anything, but because he kept speaking a truth about sidality, about the Second Vatican Council, about what it means to be a missionary church in the modern world into a room that was often not ready to receive it. And prophets, as history shows us, again and again are rarely celebrated in the moment. They are celebrated later when the thing they were pointing to finally arrives, when the seeds they planted finally break through the ground and everyone can see them. Pierre's moment came on January 7th, 2026 in the Paul CIC Audience Hall in Rome, when Pope Leo XIV stood up and called Vatican II, guiding star of the Church's journey. When the Pope, without naming Pierre, without a ceremony, without a single word of direct reference, confirmed everything that man had spent a decade trying to say. That is what vindication looks like when it comes quietly. It doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it comes with the right words, spoken by the right person at exactly the right moment. So where does this leave us today? Archbishop Gabriel Giordano Cazia is now the Apostolic Nuncio to the United States. He brings a different background, deep experience in multilateral diplomacy, years at the United Nations, a profile built for navigating complex international relationships. He is Pope Leo XIV's man in America now, and the assignment he inherits is significant. Major episcopal appointments ahead in cities like Chicago and Los Angeles, a church still working through its divisions, a country still wrestling with what it means to hold faith and civic life together. The baton has been passed, but the vision Pierre carried across continents and decades, the vision Leo tore, confirmed from the very first days of his pontificate, that vision did not retire when Pierre did. It is still here, still alive, still being built. And here is what I want to leave you with today, because I think this is the real reason this story matters. Beyond the Church, beyond the Vatican, beyond the names and the titles and the diplomatic protocol, there is something deeply human about what happened between Pierre and Leo XIV. Something that goes beyond religion, beyond institution, beyond any particular tradition. It is the story of a man who stayed faithful to what he believed in rooms that weren't ready, in a culture that resisted across years, that tested his patience, and who lived long enough to see the thing he believed confirmed, not by circumstance, not by luck, by the Pope himself in front of the whole world. And it is the story of a leader, Leo XIV, who understood that the greatest thing he could do in those first weeks of his pontificate was not to announce something new. It was to confirm something true, something that had been true all along, even when it wasn't popular, even when it wasn't convenient, even when the room wasn't listening. That is what leadership looks like, when it is rooted in something deeper than strategy. That is what faithfulness looks like when it outlasts the resistance. Pierre planted the seeds. Leo XIV is watering them. And somewhere in the American church and parishes and dioceses and communities shaped by the bishops, Pierre helped put in place. Those seeds are still growing. The story is not over. It is still unfolding. And we will be here to tell it. If this story moved you, share it right now with someone who needs to hear it. A friend, a family member, someone who loves the church and wants to understand what is really happening inside it. This is the kind of story that gets lost in the noise. Help us make sure it doesn't. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't yet. Every week, we go deep on the stories that matter. The ones behind the headlines, the ones that take time and attention to understand, the ones that stay with you long after the video ends. This is what we do here, and we're just getting started. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being here, and God bless you wherever in the world you are watching from today. But before you go, I want to sit with something for just a moment longer. because I think there's a dimension of this story we haven't fully explored yet. And it's the one that I find most powerful. We've talked about Pierre, we've talked about Leo XIV, we've talked about Baltimore and Rome and the words that connected them. But there's a question underneath all of it that I think is worth asking out loud. What does it actually cost to carry a vision that the room isn't ready for? Not in theory, not in the abstract. What does it actually feel like year after year to stand in front of people and say something true and watch them look away? To deliver a message with everything you have and then drive home and wonder if any of it landed? To serve faithfully, patiently, without complaint, not because anyone is asking you to, but because you believe the work matters even when the results aren't visible. That is not a small thing. That is one of the hardest things a human being can be asked to do. And Cardinal Pierre did it for nearly 10 years in America. He did it without bitterness, at least none that showed. He did it without abandoning the message, softening it, adjusting it to make it more palatable to the room. He said what he believed. He represented what the Pope asked him to represent, and he kept doing it even when the resistance was real and the applause was absent. That kind of faithfulness is rare, and it deserves to be named. Pope Leo XIV named it not directly, not with Pierre's name, but in the most powerful way possible, by standing up in front of the whole church and saying, "This is what I believe. This is what we are building. This is the road we are walking." And in doing so, he gave every person who has ever carried something true into a room that wasn't ready. He gave them something to hold on to. Because if Pierre's 10 years of patient faithfulness could be confirmed by a pope in a single audience, then maybe the things we carry, the convictions we hold, the values we try to live, the truths we keep speaking into spaces that don't always want to hear them, maybe those things are not wasted either. Maybe they are seeds too. Maybe the ground is being prepared in ways we cannot see. That is the theology underneath this story. And it is also, I think, the reason so many people feel something when they hear it. Even people who are not Catholic, even people who don't follow the Vatican or care about church politics. Because the experience of being faithful to something true in a world that is often more interested in what is convenient is a deeply human experience. It belongs to everyone. Pierre lived it at the highest levels of one of the world's oldest institutions. But the shape of his story, the years of patient service, the resistance, the quiet vindication, that shape is familiar. We recognize it because most of us have lived some version of it in our own lives. And that is why this story matters. Not just as a chapter in church history, but as a reminder of what it looks like to stay the course when the course is hard, to trust the vision when the room isn't ready, to keep planting when you can't yet see what will grow. Pierre planted. Leo XIV is watering. And the harvest in the American church, in the communities shaped by the vision both men shared, is still coming. We don't always get to see the full fruit of what we plant. But sometimes, just sometimes, we get a moment like January 7th, 2026. A moment when the Pope stands up in Rome and says the same words we said when no one was listening. And suddenly everything makes sense. That moment came for Cardinal Christophe Pierre. And I think if we stay faithful to what we believe, moments like that are possible for all of us too. Thank you for watching this story all the way to the end. If it meant something to you, leave a comment below and tell me why. Tell me what stayed with you. Tell me where you're watching from. I want to know. And subscribe to this channel because the stories we tell here are exactly this kind of story. Deep human, rooted in what is real every single week. God bless you. We'll see you in the next one. One last thing. There is a phrase that Cardinal Pierre used in his farewell address at the Apostolic Nunciature on January 30th, 2026, his 80th birthday. The day the church came together to honor what he had built. He spoke about his years in America as very beautiful years, difficult years, full of tensions at times. Beautiful, difficult, full of tensions. That is an honest description of a life faithfully lived. Not sanitized, not performed, just true. The beauty and the difficulty held together without pretending one cancels out the other. That kind of honesty is its own form of witness. And it is one more reason why this man and the Pope who honored his vision deserve to be known just by the church, by anyone willing to pay attention to what quiet, patient, faithful service actually looks like when it runs its full course. Pierre's course has not ended. He remains in good health. He has said he will go wherever the Pope sends him, as he always has. His next chapter is still being written. And Leo XIV, still in the early years of a pontificate that is only beginning to show its full shape, is still watering the seeds. The story continues, and we will be here to tell